Hey Arlo and Frank, I want to welcome you to the second video of what looks like it's going to be 5 videos in the series called Building a Fascinating Vocabulary. Now in the first video in this series, we talked about building something else, building what's called a commonplace book, a book where you keep all kinds of quotations and things that you glean from everyday life. You can write down poems. It can be things that you think up or things that you heard somebody else say. But one of the things that you can do is you can write down vocabulary words and keep them in there. And then you read that commonplace book regularly, so you're constantly refreshing your memory on all the things, the quotations, the vocabulary words, everything. Now in this video, we're going to talk about 6 different things. The first is making sure that people understand you. The second is there are certain words that you need to know to understand what's going on in the world. They're not real easy words. They're not difficult. They're not obscure at all. But they're words that, and this is the minimum that I'm giving you. All these things are the minimum. You guys should run with this. Make your vocabulary as big and as fascinating as you possibly can. Because if you have a fascinating vocabulary and people like to hear you speak, there's a good possibility you're going to lead a fascinating life. You're going to be fulfilled. You're going to make those around you happy. There's all kinds of things that you can do when you're fascinating. And the first part of that is the first part that people hear. After they see you, then they hear you. They hear you speak. And when people say, oh, my first impression of that person was blah, 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 they're not talking about necessarily what they saw, even though that's part of it. But they're speaking about what they heard. And the saying is that first impressions are lasting impressions. When you have a bad first impression of somebody, it's very hard for them to convince you that first impression is wrong. It's just human nature. And then we're going to talk about language at work and play and school. Then we're going to talk about some fascinating words that have a story. And when words have a story and you know that story and you can drop that story into what you're saying that uses that word, then people will be fascinated. It'll become more evident when we get to that part. The 5th part is we're going to talk about some powerful words. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how to specifically acquire a fascinating vocabulary. So let's get started. In life, you want to have civil conversations. You want to have orderly, respectful conversations with those around you, even though you may disagree vehemently with them. What happens in life is people digress. As soon as they find out, like, oh, this guy is a right-winger and I'm a left-winger, or vice versa, or whatever. This guy's a communist and I'm a socialist. That the next thing that they do is they just devolve into screaming at each other. Nobody hears what the other person's saying. Nobody understands what the other person says. That's the quickest way to fall off the cliff in a conversation is to have somebody not understand what you're saying. There was a guy when I was growing up, and I thought I was a radical left-winger, his name was, maybe it still is, I don't know if he's still alive, Abbie Hoffman. He wrote a book called Steal This Book. So he was like, oh, I'm a real anarchist. But he said something, and I'm going to paraphrase. He said something like this: when you're trying to convince people to do something that you want them to do, use the words that they understand. Don't try to impress them with your large vocabulary and have them scratching their head and going, wow, I think I agreed with that guy, but I don't know. I didn't understand what the heck he was talking about. There's a lot of words that you can use that will confuse people. I'm going to give you a couple examples here. One of them is the word noisome. If you say, oh, well, that was noisome, the normal person is going to think that you're saying something like, well, it's noisy. I'm being, that what you did was noisome. You're noisome. They're going to think, well, noisy. I'm not noisy. I'm being pretty quiet. But it doesn't mean that. The root of that word is related to noxious and obnoxious and annoyance. That's the noise. It's not the noise from like loud noise. It's from annoyance. And it means offensive or disgusting, as in a noisome smell, like, ooh, that's noisome. Nobody knows that word. And when you use a word like that, and I'll tell you in a second how you can use it, but when you use a word like that, you're going to come off sounding like a sanctimonious a-hole. And the only time that you purposely want to sound like a sanctimonious a-hole is if you're an English professor at a university, because that's their job description, to walk around using words that nobody else knows, so that like younger people can learn those words so that they can eventually know words that nobody else knows and can't communicate with people. So unless you are an English professor, then don't do this. But here's how you can do it. There's another word called quotidian. I think you might even be able to pronounce it quotidian. But most people are going to pronounce it quotidian. And it sounds like it has something to do with quoting something. But it doesn't. It means everyday or commonplace. So let's just say that you want to drop that word into a conversation. Just like noisome. Nobody knows the word quotidian. You're in a non-academic situation, and you just feel it's the best word to use. And you put it in there, and you say something like this: I don't think that his idea is unique at all. In fact, it's quite quotidian. We run into ideas like that every day. So what you're doing, I'll tell you first what you're not doing. You're not going, it's quotidian. Do you know what that means? That's the worst thing. Because then there's a 50% chance, maybe more than a 50% chance that the person's going to go, no, I don't know what that means. I'm stupid. Tell me what it means, Mr. Professor sounding sanctimonious a-hole. And it's also not saying, well, it's quotidian, and that means this. What you're doing is you're saying the word, and then you're going, we hear words like that every day. You're saying to the person, I'm pretty sure you know this word, but they don't. And then you drop the bomb and say, yeah, we hear these things every day. So they can just act like it's called safe facing. They can face saving. That's easy for me to say. And in fact, we're going to talk about spoonerisms later, and I just did a spoonerism. safe phasing. But more about that later. So you're giving them the word, then you're giving them the context that it's used in, so that they understand by the end of the sentence what you're talking about. Because at the end of the day, that's really what you want in civil discourse. In fact, really in almost any discourse that you have, any conversations that you have with people, you want them to understand what you're talking about. Second, I want to talk to you about some words that you need to understand to know what's going on around you in life. There's words that you're going to hear, and a lot of people think they know what they mean, and I guarantee that they don't know what they mean. One of them is apocryphal. Now, this is a word that's been around for a long time. It means of doubtful authenticity. So, you guys are both familiar with the Bible. There's also a book of stories, and the Bible's a book of stories. There's a book of stories that are kind of biblical stories, but they're called the Apocrypha. And the reason is because the grand poobahs of the Christian church, when they came together in, 200 or 300 AD, and said, wait a minute, there's people reading a lot of stuff that we're pretty sure wasn't written by anybody with any authority and shouldn't be part of the Bible. So they sat down and went through book by book by book and said, yeah, we're going to keep this one, we're going to throw this one out. And the ones that they threw out they were absolutely thrown out by the Protestant churches, but the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has them in their Bible, and they're called the Apocrypha. And they understand that they're not inspired by God. There's stories about things that happened in the Bible. There's stories about people who were in the Bible, but there's a very good possibility that they were written later by somebody and that they have what's called myth in them. And myth is based on some truth, but it's not the truth. And we're going to talk about that at length when I do a series on myth. So we have apocryphal, of doubtful authority, of doubtful authenticity. And then the next word is anecdotal. Anecdotal evidence is based on things like personal observation, case study reports, or like random investigations. And so they could be true, but quite often they're not. And the reason that they're not is because there's something that you have to watch out for. And I'm going to talk about this a lot more when I do logical fallacies. I'm going to do at least one, maybe two videos on logical fallacies. And that is, don't equate correlation with causation. You know, if every time the cat meows, it rains, that's a really odd occurrence. But you might say, well, wait a minute, I've observed it 100 times, and every time the cat meows, within an hour it rains. So it must, for rain to start, it must have to have the cat meowing. We know that's not true. It's why I picked a really weird example to show you, like, no, just because two things line up all the time doesn't mean that one causes the other. Sometimes they do. But the way that you prove causation of that correlation, just because things happen in this order doesn't mean that the first one caused the second one, is by doing an empirical study, an empirical scientific experiment. And there's certain rules to that experiment. It's got to be a double-blind study. We're not going to talk about that much here, but it has to be a scientific experiment that's proven by the facts uncovered by the scientists. and then reviewed by the scientific community so other people can weigh in and go, wait a minute, you got this all wrong. So that's how you prove a fact. So something that's not a scientific fact is anecdotal. Another way that people say this is that certain things are subjective and other things are objective. Subjective means that they're subject to your opinion. You're looking at something and saying, it appears to me that A causes B. It appears to me that when the cat meows, it rains. Therefore, for it to rain, the cat has to meow, because every time the cat meows, it rains, and every time it rains, the cat meows. And you have to go further than that, and you have to do the scientific study. So there's a lot of times out there that you're going to be talking to somebody and they're going to say, I'm going to prove that A causes B. And you're going to know that, like, no, you didn't. That's anecdotal. That's based on some random study that wasn't scientific. It's based on your opinion. It's based on your observations, some case study that you did, but it's not based on scientific evidence. And even sometimes things, or a lot of times, things that are found to be facts based on scientific evidence, when more evidence turns up later, as the world progresses, we find out that, hey, that wasn't true. I don't want to go into it, but there was a reason why, Einstein proved some things that Sir Isaac Newton thought were true to not be exactly true. But at the time that Newton came up with them, they explained the world. And then Einstein said, yeah, well, there's a little better explanation. Another word is alacrity, and alacrity is a cheerfulness, a readiness, a promptness, or a willingness. It's how you should approach your life. You should, when you do something, throw everything at that something. Be the best you can be. Do it with alacrity. Another word is archetype. Now, an archetype is the original pattern, the original model for something, which all things of the same kind are copied from, or which they're based on. So it's like a prototype. A prototype is, say you're going to develop a nuclear-powered car. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to build one and say, well, this is a model of one. This is what it would look like. And maybe it's a smaller version, not a full-size model. And you figure out the engine, and you'd be able to show people, hey, this is what it looks like. But everything has an archetype. In psychology, Carl Jung called it a collectively inherited unconscious idea, pattern of thought, or image, etc. So it's something that's within all of us. There's archetypical thoughts that mankind has had. And it doesn't matter. You can take some tribe on a desert island that never ran into anybody else and put that person in the same room as some executive from the board of directors of some company in New York City, and there are certain things that they're both going to believe. There's certain thoughts that they're both going to have had, and they're archetypical thoughts. They were present in the beginning. Like the archetypical man is Adam. He was the first man. Every man that descended from Adam has certain characteristics that Adam gave to that person. So you have things from the archetypical man, Adam. It's also universally in psyches. And there's certain archetypical things in like history, in myth, in culture. Here's one in myth. There's the hero takes a journey, The hero goes out and he goes on a vision quest. He's presented with a problem, this giant problem in his life, and he takes a journey. Well, every culture has that story, and they follow the same lines. It's an archetypical story. Now, these words were Apocryphal, Anecdotal, Alacrity, and Archetype. I didn't plan that they would all start with the letter A, but they just happened to. The third thing I want to talk about today is there are many words that you need to know to have conversations with people in various corners of your personal world. Right now, Arlo, you're not in school yet. Frank, I know you went to high school. I don't think you've gone to any college yet. But if you go back to school, you want to know the vocabulary of whatever it is you're studying. You need to learn the words to be able to describe what you're doing. If you're an English major, hey, you're going to sound like a sanctimonious a-hole if you're very successful. If you're an engineer, you're gonna be well conversed in engineering terms, describing things technically like an engineer does, way different than how an artist describes things. In the workplace, whatever your job is, be you a ditch digger or the President of the United States, there is a vocabulary that you need to know. If you're a lawyer, it's going to be a giant vocabulary. If you're a guy who fixes air conditioners for a living, you're going to have a pretty good one, but it's not going to be the size of a lawyer's. But you can have crappy lawyers who don't know what they're talking about and really, really good air conditioner technicians. And part of that is, do you know the language to describe what you're doing when you're fixing something, working on something, taking care of something? Your hobbies, your interests. You should be able to describe them. Use the words that are particular to that hobby, to that interest. The Bible. You should be, there's a whole bunch of words that people use in studying the Bible. I'm not going to get into them because they're not necessarily fascinating. And we're going to stick to the fascinating ones here. But you want to build up in your commonplace book the vocabulary you need: school, job, interests, hobbies, Bible study. And then the fourth thing that I want to discuss is there are certain words that are fascinating. When you hear them, they're just fascinating words. And they also have a story behind them. And you can use that word and that story to paint a beautiful picture. Just like an artist takes the palette and they mix the colors on the palette with the brush, and then they paint on the canvas to make a beautiful picture, you can do that with the words you use and the way you fit those words into the conversation. And quite often, if it's a really interesting, fascinating word, by saying, and you know the background of this word, it really draws your audience in when you can do things like that. I'll give you some examples. Here's a word that goes back to the 1580s. It's portmanteau. Now, what portmanteau was a flexible traveling case or bag for clothes and other necessaries, which is an old word. People don't say it that way anymore. From Middle French, portmanteau, traveling bag. But it evolved into a word, a portmanteau evolved into the word for a two-part suitcase. And the suitcases that we brought on this cruise, like in the background here, we're in Cozumel. It's kind of a crappy day, as you can see, but we're enjoying the port of Cozumel. We're enjoying the Scarlet Lady Virgin Cruises. We brought suitcases on board, and they have 2 compartments, and you fold them together and make one carrying case, one suitcase for clothing. But what the word portmanteau means now is a blending of 2 words into one. So you take 2 disparate words, 2 different words, and you put them together and you make a brand new word. But they usually have, just like when you put the 2 parts of your suitcase together, you have this half and this half. So the words mean the same thing, but you put them together to describe something that needs both of those words. So here's a couple of examples that I thought. Belly button. You have a belly, and then there's this round thing that's attached to an umbilical cord. When you're born, it's cut, and the thing that's left there looks like a button, so it's your belly button. And it went from probably a belly button. Now that it's called the navel, that's the real name for it. It's not a portmanteau word, but belly button is everybody knows what you're talking about. Or jelly bean. So you have these bean-shaped things that are made out of jelly. So they're, go from bean-shaped things made out of jelly to jelly beans to jelly beans. That's a portmanteau word. And when you use a portmanteau word, you can go, hey, and jelly bean, and or that's a portmanteau word. People are interested in things like that. You're not necessarily going, you don't know what a portmanteau word means, do you? You're just informing them. Like, hey, it's an interesting word. They're compound words, 2 words that are put together. The word portmanteau for this kind of a word came from Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland. And he invented a whole bunch of words for a book called Jabberwocky. I think it's a book. I've never read it. It might be a poem. On the meaning of 2 words packed up into one word, or 2 meanings packed up into one word. Another interesting word is a factotum. And when you hear a factotum, it sounds like, oh, that must be a genius, somebody who has a lot of facts. But that's not what factotum is talking about. It's kind of a portmanteau word, in a way. It's the fact comes from the same root as factory, to make. And a totem comes from the same word as total. In total, all the things together. So it's make all things. So a factotum is somebody who can do a whole bunch of things, maybe not really good, but they can accomplish a whole bunch of different things. That's a great resume word. When you're writing a resume to try to get a job, you can say, I'm a real factotum. I'm a jack of all trades. If you give me something you need me to do, it doesn't matter what field it's in, I'll figure out a way to get it done. I'm a factotum. Here's another word, quixotic. Quixotic means extravagantly chivalrous or romantic, visionary, impractical or impracticable, impulsive, and often rashly unpredictable. Where does this word come from? Well, there's a book called Don Quixote, and it was written by Cervantes in Spanish. It's about this man who's a knight, and he has a helper, his sidekick. He's the original sidekick. All superheroes have sidekicks. Well, Quixote was kind of like a superhero in his own mind. he was going out to do all these chivalric deeds like the knights of old did. But he wound up like he was going to fight this giant, but the giant turned out to be a windmill. And there's an expression, jousting with windmills, that comes from that. And Sancho Panza keeps him out of trouble, but he proves through the whole thing that he's the smarter guy, that he's the one with sense. So all these things describe Don Quixote. He's very chivalrous. He was romantic, visionary, practical, impulsive, and rashly unpredictable. So when you say that somebody is quixotic, you're saying that there's somebody who's doing things that they're probably never going to be able to do, but they're doing them because they have a heart of romance, that they really feel that these things need to get done. Nobody questioned Don Quixote's heart. And so it's a fascinating word, because you can use it to describe somebody's failures, but show that they have the right aims in mind. Another one is seminal. Now, every person's life begins by something called semen being placed into the mother of the person, and it combines with the eggs that the mother produces and creates a zygote, which turns into a fetus, becomes a baby, and then it's born. So the beginning of life is seminal. And the word for seed in things like in Spanish, in Romance languages, usually have SEM in them. I think it's semilla in Spanish. So what it means, even in botany, is that if something's seminal, it has a possibility of future development. Now for you guys, because you're not necessarily botanical, it's highly original and influencing the development of future events. In other words, it's what makes you who you are. The seminal events in your life are the events that created the Frank of today, the Arlo of today. I'm getting ready to do a video on 3 songs that were seminal songs to me. They were songs that made me the person that I am, the thinker that I am, the musician that I am. They were big influences over my life. Excuse me. Now next is a spoonerism. Did you ever want to have something named after you, so that everybody from now on, every time they hear your name, they go, or they hear that word, they say, oh, that was named after Frank Maiorini, that was named after Arlo Clark. Well, be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. If you transposition the initial sounds of words, and by accident almost all the time, as in, instead of saying a crushing blow, you say a blushing crow, you just made a spoonerism. And the guy Spooner was the Reverend William A. Spooner, who was born in 1844, died in 1930. He was the warden of New College in Oxford, England. And he was known for making these disfigures of speech. So here's a couple other examples that I came up with. You might want to say, give us a telling word, and say, give us a welling turd. Or if you see a a bull that just can't get his stuff together, and he always messes up. And you want to say a bumbling steer, but you say, oh, look at that stumbling deer. Those are both spoonerisms. Another word is protean. And protean means readily assuming different forms or characters, extremely variable, changeable in shape or form, such as an amoeba, which, although you don't know what that is yet, but Frankie, you studied amoebas in science class. They're things that you have to look into a microscope to see. And a lot of times, protean is used to describe an actor or actress, to say that they're versatile, that they're able to play many kinds of roles, disparate, all kinds of different roles. And these all look back to somebody from Greek mythology called Proteus. Now, who is Proteus? Proteus had certain knowledge about things, a lot of knowledge about things, but he didn't want to tell anybody what he knew. So in order to get the secrets that Proteus knew, you had to surprise him, capture him while he was asleep, and tie him up. And then he would try to get away. And the way that he would try to get away is he would turn himself into all different kinds of things. He could turn himself into a bird and try to fly away, a fish and try to swim away. He was a god. And if you could hold him long enough, eventually he would tell you the secret that you were looking for. And before that happened, he would return to his normal shape. He would turn into himself again. And as soon as he was done telling you the answer, he would plunge into the sea. Now in the Odyssey by Homer, in book 4, it was Menelaus who captured him to find out how to escape from the island of Pharos, which is where this Proteus lived, the god Proteus. Another word is pithy. And pithy, not to be confused with pissy, is brief, forceful, and meaningful in expression, full of vigor, substance, or meaning, terse, forcible, a pithy observation, or full of pith, and pith is that white stuff in an orange peel, and that's where it comes from. All that stuff is described by that pithy, astringent tasting pith in an orange. Another is a bugaboo. Bugaboo is something that causes fear or worry. And sometimes they try to scare a kid and say, the boogeyman's coming. The bogeyman's coming, however you want to pronounce it. And the origin of the boogaboo is something to frighten a child, a fancied object of terror. In the Dictionary of American Slang, it's associated with boogaboo, B-U-G-I-B-U, a demon in an old French poem called The Aliscans from 1141 AD. So over 1,000 years ago. And the last one of these words is halcyon. Halcyon means happy, blissful, or carefree. A lot of times people talk about the halcyon days of their youth. Another definition is prosperous or wealthy. And so you have the halcyon times of peace, when the economy was good, everybody had a job and things like that. Now, where did this word come from? It's relating to something called the halcyon, which was a bird, also called the kingfisher. It was a mythical bird, usually identified with the kingfisher, said to breed about the time of the winter solstice in a nest floating on the calm sea, and to have the power of charming winds and waves into calmness. So it would charm the winds. If it was windy out like it is out today, this bird could trick the winds into calming down. So, number 5, powerful words. Well, the first word that's powerful is the word power. And how you say words can make them powerful. You say the word power, and you're adamant. Power. It gives that word power. In the old Batman shows, when I was a kid, they would get in a fist fight. Batman and Robin would be fighting one of the criminals and his gang, and they would put on the screen as people got punched, like bam, pow, bang. These kind of words are often onomatopoeic. And onomatopoeia is things that sound like what they are, like a dog barks and a duck quacks. And when you listen to a duck, it goes quack, quack, quack. So that's an onomatopoeia, where something describes it by making the sound. Here's another powerful word, compelling. You can tell somebody, I have a good idea to tell you. And that's okay. But if you tell them, I have a compelling idea. Well, what's compelling mean? It forces or pushes you to a course of action. It's overpowering. It's a word that describes like an overpowering idea. Having a powerful and irresistible effect, requiring acute admiration, attention, or respect. Now, these words are words that start with B or P, but they don't always start with it. Like bang and power start with B and P. Compelling has the P in the middle of it, beginning of the second syllable. And a lot of the words that are powerful words like this have either a P or a P, and those letters are not that different. Bellicose is another word. It means inclined to fighting, warlike, valorous, given to fighting. And when you describe somebody as bellicose, it's saying you're a powerful warrior. It's not always used as a good thing. Now, sixth and lastly, how do you acquire a fascinating vocabulary? Read broadly. Read things like the Bible, of course. Read the classics. All kinds of classic books from the past by the great authors, Shakespeare, Hemingway, Dickens, and everybody in between. Read books about psychology and philosophy to learn about how the mind works. They both approach the same subject in a different way. Read history. And then write down words that you don't understand when you hear them, and make sure you look them up as soon as you can. And how do you learn commonplace book now. So you write them in your commonplace book and you put in there the definition, the roots of the word, the history, and the story of the word, and then making it yours by tying it to someone or something in your life. If it reminds you of a certain person or a certain thing or a certain place, tie the word to that so that every time you think of that word, you think of that person or place, and you remember what the word means and how to use it. So in closing, let's review. We looked at 6 things this time. First, making sure that people understand you. Second, some words you need to know to understand what's going on in the world around you. Third, language in school, work, play, in your interests and hobbies, etc. Number 4, fascinating words with a story that you can use to paint a verbal picture for those who are listening to you. Number 5, we looked at some powerful words just by the sound of them. They're powerful and how to use them. And number 6 and last, how to acquire a fascinating vocabulary. Next time, we're not going to be looking at civil discourse. We're going to be looking at not so civil discourse. In other words, words about getting in somebody's face. Until then, guys, peace out.